How to start home brewing. I've been home brewing now for about 5 years, but I often get asked how to start home brewing. There are several different ways that you can start, ranging from buying a kit online to just buying ingredients and having a go. You don't need a lot of kit to get started, but as you progress, you will find that you'll add to your home brewing kit. Today, I'm going to tell you how I started home brewing, tell you what the minimal amount of equipment you need to be able to start home brewing, what type of ingredients you can use, and the basic process of brewing. When I began home brewing, I was living in a 1-bedroom flat, so I needed a very small kit to be able to fit in there. I was also on the top floor, so I couldn't do anything outside. It had to be inside my flat in the kitchen. I looked for small batch brewing kits and I found one that was called Stove Toppers that was from Brew UK. This kit came with the minimal equipment that you needed, but it also came with all grain ingredients. We'll talk about the difference between the ingredients that you can get in kits later on. By starting with a kit, then you have all of the ingredients you need. You don't need to weigh anything out and you can just follow the instructions that come with the kit. So it is an easy way to start home brewing. As my kit was called Stove Topper, it did mean that you could do it just on your stove in the kitchen. You didn't need to have any fancy all-in-one units. You literally used 2 pots and a sieve. So what is the minimal equipment you need for starting home brewing? You will need 2 big pots. You will need one to use as your mash tun, which is where you will steep the grains in water. It's a good idea to have a second pot that you can use to heat up the water that you will put through during the sparge to add to your wort, which is what will become the beer. With 2 pots, you're able to get the water going at the same time and saves you some time in the long run. When I started, I only had 1 pot and ended up with water in several different saucepans all over the kitchen. Don't fall for the same mistake that I did. You'll also need a really big sieve. A general kitchen sieve is not going to be big enough. You want it the same size and diameter as the pot that you are using. This sieve has got to contain all of the grain that you use in your brewing, which can be up to and above 1 kilogram. So it needs to be quite a big sieve. You'll need a spoon to be able to stir your grains before you start your mash. So this needs to be quite a long spoon, and it's better for it to be plastic than wooden because you can keep it cleaner. You will also need a thermometer to measure the temperature of your water, and for the end of the brewing to measure the temperature of the wort before you pitch your yeast. Once you've done the main boil part of brewing, the hot side, you will need a fermenter to put your wort into with the yeast. This can be a plastic bucket with a lid and a hole to attach an airlock to, or a glass demijohn. I like a glass demijohn because then you can see what's happening in the fermentation of your beer, but lots of people use plastic fermentation buckets. You will also need a funnel to be able to transfer the beer from your brewing pot into your fermenter. With your fermenter, you will need an airlock. This shows you that fermentation is happening, and all of these items will need to be sanitized, either with a rinse or no rinse sanitizer. Finally, once your beer has finished fermenting, you will need to put it into a container. Bottles are the easiest way to start, and you will need some form of piping to get the beer out of the fermenter into the bottles. If you get a bucket for your fermenter, often there's a tap on the bottom, which can be much easier than trying to transfer it via gravity with plastic tubing from a demijohn. So the first kit that I had was called Stove Toppers, and it came with what is called all grain. So brewing in a brewery, they use bags of grain. Some kits come with what is called malt extract. This can be in powder form and you mix it up, or it can come in a tin and looks a bit like syrup. This has already got the malt and the fermentable sugars in it. It can also be hopped. Some kits come with this and you just boil that in water to create your wort. I had to work out what that was because my first kit was all grain and had the grains in it rather than this malt extract. Malt extract may be easier for you to begin with. Have a look around at different kits that you can get online or in Wilkinson's, or if you have a local brewing shop, to see what will work best for you. I liked doing all grain. It felt like just as brewers were doing that I had seen, and you can then control what different flavours and aromas you get in your beer. However, you do have to weigh out different ingredients, and as you progress, if you don't buy a kit which has it already weighed out, you do end up with lots of bags of different grain. If you'd like to start brewing, here is your basic process. You will need to have water brought up to 72 degrees Celsius that you're going to put your grains in. These grains or malt extract may already be weighed out and organised for you in your kit. You will need to do a mash for at least 60 minutes, depending on the recipe and the beer that you are producing. And you need to keep your mash at a consistent temperature. This is where you need an accurate thermometer. Once the mash time has passed, you need to mash out. And in this case, you will stir the mash for about 7 minutes to stop the process of the extraction of enzymes and starches, which create fermentable sugars. Once you've mashed out, you need to remove the grains from the water, which is now called wort, and this is called sparging. You also use more water that you've heated up, which is why you need a second pot, to wash more sugars from the grains so that you've got as much fermentable sugar for the yeast to eat on as possible. The sparge can take anything from between 20 minutes to an hour, depending on how much grain you've got and how thorough you want to be. This is where you need your sieve, and it can be quite messy. Once you've extracted the grains from the wort, you are then going to boil your wort, depending on your recipe, usually at least an hour. During that hour, you will add hops at different intervals, depending on your recipe. In a kit, you should have your hops already weighed out for you, and it will tell you when to add them. One top tip that I learnt while I was learning about home brewing was that on the recipe, it will say 60 minutes. That does not mean you add it after 60 minutes have gone. That means that the hops will be in the brew for 60 minutes. So you will add them at the beginning of the boil. So the timing on the recipe is how long the hops will be in the boil. I found that a home smart speaker that you can add timers to is very useful in the brewing process. Once you have finished your boil, you need to cool the wort to an appropriate temperature for the yeast you'll be using, and then you will pitch your yeast. A good way to cool your wort is in an ice bath. I have found that buying the big bags of ice from the supermarket and putting them in the sink filled with cold water is the best way to do an ice bath. As I've progressed, I've added a wort chiller to my brew kit so that I can get my wort cooled more quickly. But to start off, an ice bath in your sink is a great way to cool down your wort. Again, you're going to need that thermometer to check the temperature because you don't want it to go too cold or your yeast won't do its job. And that thermometer will need to be sanitized every time it touches the wort. You want this process to be as quick as possible because the longer that the beer has contact with the air, the more chance you've got of infection. Once your wort is at the appropriate temperature for your yeast, you can transfer it to your fermenter through a funnel, and you will want to pitch your yeast, which means adding it to the wort. You will probably get a sachet of dry yeast. A good way to really get your yeast going is to rehydrate it with a little bit of warm water. I usually do this 15 minutes before the end of the boil so it can sit and get itself rehydrated and activated before I add it to my wort. Once the yeast is in the wort, you're then going to aerate it. The only time we really want to add air to the beer. This will give oxygen to the yeast so that it can do its job. Once you've aerated the wort, you'll add the airlock with a bung into the fermenter, and then you're just going to leave the wort alone to do its job. I sit mine in my living room because it keeps around a constant temperature of about 20 to 22 degrees. Think about the temperature of that is needed for the yeast you are using and store your beer appropriately. It's usually going to take you about 2 weeks to ferment the beer, maybe 3. Check the instructions of your kit, and then you're going to want to bottle it. At this point you add some sugar to rouse the yeast and to add carbon dioxide to your beer. I then leave my beer for 4 weeks to condition in the bottle, but sometimes it can take even longer. One recipe I did for a imperial stout took 18 months for the flavours to really come through. Homebrewing is a really rewarding hobby, and you can really experiment and learn as you go. YouTube is your friend. There's lots of helpful information on there. Let me know if there are any more questions you have about homebrewing so that I can create more content to help you on how to start homebrewing.